Hello and welcome to Chain Reaction, a podcast series examining America's role in the world. I am your host, Aaron Stein, the Director of Research at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia. Every 2 weeks, we will talk to experts about a variety of topics and why they matter for U.S. foreign policy. On today's program, I speak with Rachel Ellehuus, who is the Deputy Director and a Senior Fellow with the Europe, Russia, and Eurasia Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, about President Biden's recent visit to the United Kingdom, Belgium, and Geneva, Switzerland, where he met with the President of Russia, Vladimir Putin. Enjoy the show. Hello and welcome. Today I'm joined by Rachel Ellehuus, Deputy Director and Senior Fellow with the Europe, Russia, and Eurasia Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Rachel, it's good to have you back on the show.
Thanks for inviting me, Aaron.
Well, I thought you would be a perfect person to talk about the wrap up to President Biden's first overseas trip. He did a 3-country tour to the United Kingdom, Belgium, and then to Switzerland for the G7, a meeting at NATO, also a meeting with the European Union, and finally closing it out in Geneva, where I used to live, for a bilateral meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin. I think the thing that we want to talk about more is the NATO summit, and perhaps we could start there. Just what are your big thoughts about this trip, his interaction with NATO, and any of the big takeaways that you see from the meeting?
Well, I think we can see similar themes across all the legs of the trip. And I think the message that Biden was trying to communicate was that the U.S. is back. In the case of NATO, that the U.S. was committed to the alliance and to Article 5, which is the commitment that an attack on one ally is an attack on all. And he also reiterated the United States' commitment to work with allies and partners to update the so-called rules of the road. So whether that's on climate or cyber or disinformation or emerging and disruptive technologies, Biden sent a clear message that he wanted to work alongside allies and partners to make those updates. In terms of the NATO visit, I think NATO showed that they're reinforcing their core, but they're also looking to the future. Your listeners are probably familiar with the NATO 2030 concept that was launched by Secretary General Stoltenberg over the last year. That has now sort of been translated into the communique that we saw come out of the summit. So in terms of the core, NATO reinforced its commitment to deterrence and defense capabilities. We saw the integration of a new military concept that integrates cross-government tools and multi-domain tools into those deterrence and defense capabilities. NATO also adopted a new cyber defense policy, which I think is significant. They had already said that cyber was a domain that could trigger Article 5 for NATO, but updating that cyber defense policy really puts that doctrine in place in a way that communicates to adversaries that this is a space that NATO will be active in. They touched, not surprisingly, on burden sharing, but unlike his predecessor, President Biden has a broader view of burden sharing. So he doesn't just talk about the 2% and the cash that's going into the alliance. He also takes a look at the capabilities that are coming out on the other end, as well as countries' contributions to NATO missions and operations. And I think it's important that they also agreed to elevate NATO's political role. The nature of some of today's threats that are very networked and global and transnational require consultation before NATO takes action. So in many cases, consultation can help diffuse that conflict, prevent military action, and reassure allies. So I think that was very important. But looking to the future, the strategic concept, they've agreed to update the strategic concept. The last one is from 2010, and it mentions neither China or climate. So it's significant that the communique does mention both of those, and I expect the strategic concept, which should be completed by the Madrid summit next year, will tackle both of those.
Yeah, I mean, you sort of preempted my next question, but the communique that came out at the end, sort of foreshadowing the 2022 strategic concept, which is a welcome update. I believe the last one was from Wales, the Wales summit in 2010. It was longer than I think other ones have been, although you're a bit more experienced on these topics than I am. And what do you think some of the main takeaways from that document are? Again, looking forward to the update to the strategic concept.
Yes, 79 paragraphs, and at least according to my printer, about 30 pages, is longer than usual. So on the one hand, we see some of the familiar language up front about, NATO being the foundation to collective defense, seeing that commitment to Article 5. The things that strike me as new, as I mentioned, are, talking about climate change. Certainly, NATO has thought about climate change in the past, but this more deliberately spells out that NATO will tackle those security implications of climate change. So these are things like in training and exercise, NATO will think about the climate footprint, the environmental footprint that those exercises and training activities are having, and try to reduce those. NATO will also try to take steps towards doing its part to move to the global net zero goal by reducing emissions in its operations, and again, training and exercises. So that's one new aspect. China is a new aspect, and I've seen sort of mixed reactions to this. So on the one hand, there are those who feel that it's extremely significant that the alliance mentions China in several of the paragraphs of the communique, and that a sense that this almost puts China as an issue on par with the Russia threat. I think that's a slight overstatement. Certainly, when you look at the language of the communique, Russia is characterized as the most immediate threat. It's specifically called out on cyber. China is characterized, in contrast, as a challenge and not a threat. And most of the steps that NATO lays out in the communique as sort of placeholders for this strategic concept have to do with NATO taking defensive actions to prepare itself for the challenge presented by China. So these are things like increasing the resilience of NATO's supply chain, critical infrastructure, energy pathways, investing in innovation to make sure that allies can preserve their technological edge as China modernizes both on the nuclear and conventional front. And then finally, partnerships. NATO has always had a network of partnerships across the globe, but this communique specifically talks about enhancing partnerships with the European Union as well as partners in the Asia Pacific region. And that is a direct sort of allusion to dealing with China.
Can you talk a little bit about that European Union aspect? I didn't foreshadow this in our pre-podcast meeting, but it's something that did come up, which is the overlap between the Biden meeting both in Brussels with NATO, but also with the European Union, and also how that plays out into some of the things that you were just talking about in terms of partnerships.
So I think, as President Biden has said, NATO and the EU are natural partners in a number of areas. Certainly there's space for both of these organizations to bring their comparative advantages and capabilities to bear with regard to challenges like China, or climate, or building resilience. So, you do hear some European NATO allies, rumors that they are trying to limit NATO's role in this area, thinking it's a better place for national governments or the European Union to be more active. But NATO's been very clear in this communique that it's focused, again, on these security aspects of those challenges that are not entirely military in nature. So it talks about the security implications of climate change. But certainly when we're talking about developing green technologies and innovating, that's going to be something that happens in that US-EU channel. Similarly, on resilience, NATO will have a role to play in looking at its bases, its infrastructure, its supply chains, but there will also be an aspect that falls to the EU in terms of societal resilience. So I really think that today's challenges lend themselves to this natural partnership between the EU and NATO, and there's space for both organizations.
Well, now I have to turn to sort of one of the things that was, annoying me before the NATO meeting, which was the number of hot takes and analysis about one of Biden's bilaterals, which was with Turkish President Erdogan. Obviously the two men know each other for a very long time. They have had one telephone call before this, rather odd, or at least I shouldn't say odd, but, a departure from the norm in terms of American presidents engaging with their Turkish counterparts. And that first phone call was the Biden administration informing Erdogan that they would recognize the Armenian genocide, which added emphasis to this rather short but nevertheless consequential bilateral between Biden and Erdogan at the on the margins of the NATO summit. We don't know a lot about the meeting, but perhaps you can give some of your initial thoughts about what the meeting meant and what it suggests for U.S.-Turkish relations.
I think it's really important that the meeting happened. Under the previous administration, we saw almost a direct line of communication between President Trump and President Erdogan. And that's not really how we should be doing conducting our foreign policy and our security and defense policy. So on the one hand, this meeting established some of those regular lines of communications between the State Department, the Defense Department, the National Security Council, and their Turkish counterparts. I mean, I could see from the photos that Secretary Blinken, Secretary of Defense Austin, and Jake Sullivan were all in the meeting as well. So for me, it really enforces those lines of communication being reestablished among counterparts rather than having this direct route, which we saw previously. I think it was also an opportunity for Biden to communicate our shared interests with Turkey, areas where we think we can work together, but also our expectations. I hesitate to say red lines because those always seem sort of dangerous pathways. But certainly, I think Biden communicated that Turkey had certain obligations as a NATO ally to act constructively in that framework. Biden likely also mentioned human rights. Values in foreign policy has been part of and a hallmark of this administration's approach, not just with regard to Turkey, but with regard to Russia, China, and a number of other countries. And I think it was important that he did that because the U.S. needs to show that while we're prepared to cooperate and deal with Erdogan, we're also trying to prepare for a Turkey after Erdogan.
Yeah, and it does seem like, from my understanding, and at least my basic readout, is the Biden team, and it's a good segue to the final meeting here, is almost treating Turkey like a frenemy. I don't want to use the word adversary, and I'm stealing that term from Stephen Cook, who wrote, I think, the seminal piece on this as far back as 2012, which is compartmentalizing the areas with which we disagree. And I think the most obvious is on the S-400 and elements of Syria policy, and trying to figure out areas where we can cooperate. And I think the hallmark of that is after the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, the NATO withdrawal from Afghanistan by September 11th, is that there may be a Turkish contingent that's left behind to secure the Kabul airport. And so I think that is now the centerpiece of U.S.-Turkish bilateral talks beyond the disagreements. This is the area where we can cooperate. Do you get that sense, or am I leaving some stuff out?
No, I would completely agree with that assessment. This ability to compartmentalize and find those areas of cooperation is very important in this relationship. Turkey is an ally, and I think Biden's approach is to deliver any tough messages or deal with any disagreements behind closed doors. To me, that's a smart approach because the only winners of allies fighting openly are adversaries who will seize on those differences and try to exploit them to further undermine those relationships. And if we contrast this to Biden's meeting with Putin, I do think it's different. Erdogan certainly has some domestic incentives to align some of his policies with the U.S. He wants the perception of a good relationship with the U.S. in order to have those economic ties. And as you mentioned, there are areas of overlap and cooperation. Biden often talks about his personal relationships and how he can sort of find connections with anyone, whether that's here in Congress across both sides of the aisle or internationally with some more difficult allies and partners. But again, those incentives have to align. And Turkey wants good relations with the U.S. I'm not convinced that President Putin does, actually.
This idea is that we can cooperate where there are areas of convergence, and where we disagree is you perhaps keep those behind closed doors, which I agree is a smart way to handle this. And I'll leave you with this. So I guess the final prompt or final question is, from Brussels, he went to Geneva. And in Geneva, where I think it was the most covered of the three, the UK, Belgium, and then Switzerland, was the bilateral, 4-hour or so meeting with Putin. I don't want to put you on the spot. I sort of have I called the Biden approach to Russia, and they wouldn't be happy with me calling it that, but it's like soft detente or maybe soft reset, or maybe compartmentalization is another word. How do you see that final meeting playing out within the broader context of U.S. foreign policy goals?
Well, one thing that the Erdogan and Putin meetings have in common, as you just alluded to, is their length. There's something about these meetings that lend themselves to multiple hours of discussions, but with very little readout to the rest of us as to what went on behind those closed doors. So I do find that curious. But in terms of, the Biden approach to Russia, I do think it was important to sort of reflect on the sequencing of these events. So before this meeting in Geneva with President Putin, Biden had already connected with not just EU and NATO allies and partners, but with countries in that G7 format. So that included, South Korea, that included, Australia and Japan. So I think it's important that the sequencing showed that there was this effort to align with like-minded allies and partners and get on the same page in terms of a message before having this conversation with Putin. That was particularly important for the Baltic states who did have a pull aside with Biden on the margins of the NATO ministerial. And I think that's significant. In terms of the approach, I hear you, but I think it's better than these expectations of the reset. I think Biden comes to this with a much more realist streak to his policy. He's willing to try. He's willing to, make that small concession of giving Putin the limelight and the stage alongside President Biden. But his expectations are very low. So I really don't see this as a reset. I see it more as an attempt to improve communications, de-escalate some of the tensions, find very limited areas of cooperation. Really all they put out there was, some vague statements of intent to work together on strategic stability, arms control, and I believe cyber. But as you heard in Biden's comments to the journalist on his way out of the meeting, his expectations about being able to make meaningful progress in these areas are very limited and low.
Well, I think with that, we covered it. Is there any last words that you wanted to throw in there before we do the sign off here?
No, not necessarily, Aaron. I think we saw a good trip. It was certainly a very busy week for the president, but he's shown up in person to set forward his expectations and put forward his personal brand on these various relationships. So over the next few months, we'll just watch and see what progress is made now that this architecture has been put in place.
And hopefully we can all go to Spain for the next NATO meeting, at least to sit on the sidelines, because it is one of my favorite places to visit. Hopefully we'll have the pandemic behind us.
That sounds like a good goal.
Yeah, that sounds like a good goal. So with that, Rachel, as always, thanks for joining, and have a good rest of the day.
Thanks, Aaron.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Chain Reaction. Be sure to subscribe to Chain Reaction on iTunes and Spotify, and don't forget to follow us on Twitter at the handle @FPRI. Chain Reaction is a podcast of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, a nonpartisan think tank in Philadelphia. For more information about this and other initiatives, be sure to visit www.fpri.org.